Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. We are just waiting a few minutes to give people some time to come in, and then after that, we'll get started with Ryan's presentation. Morning, everybody. I'm just going to give it one more minute to let people, we have people trickling in, and then we'll get started with Ryan's presentation.
The neighbor coming in making all this noise.
Okay, I think we should get started. Welcome everybody to the first ERE and ISEP webinar on crowdsourcing the measurement of quality of electricity services in India. We are very excited to launch this new format that allows us to reach a wider audience. And today we are pleased to have Ryan Kennedy present some new work that we have been doing in India. And I guess the format here is quite simple. Ryan is just going to give us a short presentation. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat window so that Shanda can then unmute you and we can have a little conversation. And we will finish before 11 a.m. So hopefully we can be quite efficient today. So Ryan, please take it away.
That sounds good. And before we get started, for those of you who are joining us, if you can just check to make sure that your microphone is turned off. I think we're getting a few people who have some background noise going on. First off, I apologize for my surroundings. I was supposed to be doing this from a nice office conference room. Unfortunately, the tropical storm down here had some other plans, and the university is closed for this morning. So doing this from home, luckily without the help of my 1-year-old. what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about crowdsourcing as a method for measurement. And the reason why we're looking into this is because being able to measure not just whether or not people have connections, but also the reliability of those connections is really critical. As I'll discuss later, trying to get an idea of how many people have grid connections is relatively easy, and the incentives for this measurement are pretty aligned. Trying to get good measurements for the quality of that access ends up being a much more difficult problem. And as the old saying goes, if you can't measure it, you can't really improve it. So we want to see if a relatively cheap and straightforward method can be utilized in order to try and get at this measurement. But to begin with, let's give credit where credit is due. The amount of grid connections in India has increased dramatically. So these are some charts from the Samgaya scheme. And what we see here is that this is as of March, 99% of households now have connections to the grid. Now, the issue is that these connections are of widely varying quality. In some cases, the connections that people have are relatively reliable. There may be in major cities still some problems with brownouts and other issues with connections. But as far as actually having, and in other areas, however, there are places where the electricity access is very unreliable. In fact, maybe a few hours or even less during the day. And the reason why this is important is because what we're finding out more and more is that it's not just a matter of having a grid connection, but also the quality of this grid connection that makes a real difference in terms of economic outcomes and development. If you have a connection, but it's unusable during most of the day, then it really doesn't contribute to the development. There have been multiple studies suggesting that this reliability affects everything from willingness to pay. Asim Johannes and I had done some work on this earlier, suggesting that when people see that connections in their area are not very reliable, they're less likely to pay for electricity. It can affect the ability for people to open businesses, use their electricity for studying. All kinds of problems can result if the electricity that people are receiving is unreliable. You're also just less likely to use it if it's unreliable. You're more likely to stick with things that you're used to or more reliable if you're not sure whether or not the connection is going to last for this entire time. But the question is, how do we measure it? So measuring access is relatively straightforward. You can see if a household is connected to the electrical grid. Not only that, but in terms of the incentives for measurement, the government and the private companies have a number of incentives to show that whether or not there is a connection, to show that they are making progress. On the other hand, reliability gets a little bit of a sticky problem. You just can't ask people, in general, how reliable is your connection? Because there are all kinds of things that go into that self-assessment. A person who's had a recent problem with their electricity might overestimate the problems that they have with the electricity access. There's also problems in terms of that, for both the governments and for the companies, this has proven to be a relatively difficult problem to break. In certain developing countries, I've talked with people about how it is that they measure electricity quality. And oftentimes the answer is that they rely on the reports that they get from people in the field. If they have a problem, they call in, and that's how they know that an area has problems with electricity. The issues with this kind of self-reporting are very well known. In the United States, for example, cities that use calls for service in order to figure out if there are problems have noticed that the people who call tend to be people from neighborhoods that are well organized. They tend to be in areas where the problem is relatively unusual. So you're more likely to notice that there's a problem and report it if that problem hasn't been a persistent problem. If it's been a persistent problem that's been going on for months, you're less likely to report it. So we need to have a better way of measuring it. And one of the ideas for how to do this is to look at crowdsourcing. Most of you have probably heard about crowdsourcing from any number of other applications. Probably one of the best known ones is Flu Near You, which is a national disease monitoring network where people report whether or not they have had a flu-like illness or whether or not a family member or a neighbor has had a flu-like illness. And this has been very effective at adding to the information we have for estimating the flu spread, how bad the disease outbreak is on a yearly basis, and what the likely peak is. Similarly, crowdsourcing has been used in conflict areas. There was an application that was developed in Syria, which was utilized to report where there was active fighting going on so that people could avoid those areas. All kinds of different applications for crowdsourcing. And so what we're trying to figure out here is to what extent we can utilize relatively cheap crowdsourcing methods instead of having to rely on relatively expensive monitors. The gold standard is always going to be to have an electronic monitor. But the problem is that that gold standard comes at cost. It's not only the cost of the monitor itself, the cost of installation, but also, as we found from another project that we've been working on, especially if you're trying to get household monitoring going, people tend to be very mistrustful of installing monitors. And if those monitors even take a little bit of electricity to run, people will oftentimes request for those monitors to be removed because they don't want to have that extra electricity on their bills. So to what extent can we get at this with crowdsourcing? Crowdsourcing is, like I said, it's relatively cheap. And so we try to do a research design around this. The first part of the research design is we took 12 villages in the Siddipur district of Uttar Pradesh. And we got 122 households who we initially surveyed. And this was a 15-minute survey in order to get a little bit of background on the households, find out things like education, what kinds of electrical usage they had, and various other things that we thought might affect their reporting. Initially, we thought that things like education and intensity of electricity usage would affect the accuracy of the reporting. As I'll talk about in a little bit, it turns out that this wasn't so much the case. From these households, we split them into two groups. One was going to receive a call on odd weeks. The other one was going to receive it on even weeks. And in order to make sure that they didn't all receive their phone calls on the same day of the week, we randomly assigned them 2 days of the week during the survey. And so they would be interviewed between Monday and Saturday, and the households, the day of the week of their interviews would be varying during this time. And so for about a full year, between October 30th, 2017 and September 29th, 2018, we interviewed these participants and we asked them 6 questions dealing with the hours used, the hours available, the voltage level, whether or not there were any kind of fluctuations that they noted, and also about household satisfaction. And one of the key things that we did with this was we were asking them only about the previous 24 hours. So the difference between this and just doing a one-off survey is that a one-off survey, if you just ask people, how reliable is your electricity, it's going to be affected by very recent experiences. It's going to be affected by a number of different biases. We're trying to get around this by only asking about the previous 24-hour period. And then we compared this with monitoring data from the Prius Energy Group. So they use ESM plug-in devices that are deployed at stations in these villages. And so we're able to get an idea of how reliable the electricity actually was in the village during that time. And we would think that if people are accurate in reporting this, then we should end up getting a relatively accurate signal from the people we surveyed. In total, we had, so there were some issues with either people not answering the phone, or there were some issues with the ESM plug-in devices. Sometimes they would go out, sometimes they would just have time periods where they didn't report the data the way that they were supposed to. So once all that was taken into account, we had about 1,673 complete observations that were nested in the 122 surveyed households. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, this is where Sitapur is located. It's in the central area of Uttar Pradesh. And this was our sampling strategy. So we had the 120 households, and at the 122 households, we had the assignment between odd and even weeks. And then we were assigning them throughout the weeks, throughout the days of the week, in order to make sure that we had variation across the weeks that we were interviewing. So once we collected that data, we also wanted to see what would happen if we generalized the models that we were using on the Sitapur district. So this gave us a really intensive time stream of data between the monitors and the crowdsourced responses. The second thing we wanted to do was to try applying this more generally and seeing what information we could get from a broader survey. So we had a set of households that were surveyed by International IISD with assistance from Columbia University's CJET program. And here we had 12 districts that were randomly selected from the north, south, east, and west areas of Uttar Pradesh. And we did a number of things in order to try to make sure that we were getting a representative sample of the various size villages, as well as the various size urban areas. And the goal here is to get a set of areas and a set of households that are relatively representative of Uttar Pradesh more generally. We had 960 respondents from the villages, and we had 957 household respondents in urban areas. And each of these households is interviewed over time. So they were assigned to one of 8 weeks for the first call, and they were interviewed subsequently every 8 weeks for a year time period during the same time period where we were doing the interviews in Sitapur. Here are the districts that were covered in this time period. As you can see, we have a variety of districts from all across Uttar Pradesh. And here was the sampling strategy. So you can see the block sampling of the districts, the rural districts versus the urban districts, and how these were split up. All right, so let's talk first of all of the results in Sitapur. So like I said, we asked a number of different questions at relatively, at fixed intervals. So we're asking them about the hours available, the hours used, whether or not there were any blackouts that they noticed, low voltage incidents, we asked about fluctuation, and we asked about satisfaction. As far as the monitor data, from the monitors, we had a number of different things. We had the hours of normal voltage, we had the hours of low voltage, we had any hours where there was no voltage or a blackout. And we also wanted to take a look and see if, in fact, there was any difference in terms of time period. So perhaps people were better at remembering during the last 12 hours than the last 24 hours. We thought that maybe people remembered more precisely the 6 hours, roughly corresponding with when they would be using nighttime use, so after dark usage. So we also derived 12-hour and 6-hour versions of the monitor data. What we notice immediately in terms of the correlations is that there are moderately high correlations between certain things, but the key one is the reported hours available. So this is out of 24 hours, how much they reported being available, and how much the monitors detected. We did not notice a difference between the whether or not we used a 12-hour or a 6-hour window. We also didn't notice any better reporting when it came to things like blackouts. So we found out that with, when people report blackouts, this did correlate better, reasonably well, with the low or blackout periods detected by the monitors. But again, we didn't see this as strongly as we saw just the general correlation between reported hours available and the hours that we reported from the monitoring. The correlation was not strong. It was about 0.2. So there's definitely a lot of noise, and we'll be analyzing that noise in more detail in a little while. But still, we did see a significant correlation, and a correlation that, as I'm going to try to show in the next few slides, we think is quite useful. We also noticed that there is a very strong correlation between the hours that people report available and their satisfaction with electricity. So this the perceived hours does in fact impact whether or not they are satisfied with the electricity that they are receiving. All right, we looked at two different modeling strategies in order to try and figure out what was going on, what this relationship looked like. The first strategy is just using a very simple linear regression model. Now, this is a multi-level regression model where we added a random effect for the households, on the idea that some households may be more accurate than other households over time. And there's likely to be a certain amount of reliance where people are more likely to report certain values based on household characteristics and the characteristics of the respondents. So what you're seeing here is the fixed part of that model. And what we generally find is that while there is definitely a linear, there's definitely a positive relationship. So the more hours that people report being available, the more hours that are actually available. It's still pretty far from that 45-degree line that you see going across the chart right here. This 45-degree line is what would be perfect estimation. And we can see that there is a pretty substantial gap between that perfect estimation and what we're actually seeing, with people at the very low end reporting more access than what they actually have. Indeed, we get people who had reported zero access, actually having some access with the monitors. And down here, what we see is that when people have more hours available, there's a tendency for them to underreport the actual hours that they have available. And we also see, in terms of the errors on the right, in terms of residuals, that these are very far from white noise. So there's a definite pattern that's going on here. And so we decided to try something else in order to see if we could get a little bit more at this discontinuity. So we used a simple low-S regression model in order to look for whether or not there was a nonlinear relationship between the report hours available and the actual hours available. And what we found was that indeed there was a very strong nonlinear relationship. What we find is that people on the lower end and people on the higher end actually seem to do pretty well in terms of reporting. What we don't see is here in the middle, this middle area, people don't seem to be as good at recognizing exactly how many hours were available in the 24-hour period previous. In retrospect, this makes sense that people who have 10 hours or 15 hours might have a little bit more difficulty actually estimating, and might actually have a significant underestimation, especially if those time periods when the electricity is not available are falling during time periods where they are trying to use that electricity. So, based on this, we look at the broader, the CGEP data that we were talking about before, which expands out into a variety of different areas around Uttar Pradesh. And what we're going to compare here is we are going to compare both the urban and rural areas, and we're going to look at the urban and rural areas over time. What we see across all of these different districts is somewhat what we would expect. So the rural areas tend to have, in terms of the predicted hours available based on the hours that they are reporting having electricity, what we see is that there is a gap between the urban and the rural areas. The rural areas tend to report less electricity being available, and the linear model predicts that they indeed do have less available electricity. We can see down here the gap between the two is about, on average, about 4 to 6 hours in terms of the hours daily available. We also can see that there is a significant dip in the hours available in the rural areas during time periods of heavy rainfall, so during the monsoon season. This is a time period when there is a lot more rural demand for electricity, for agriculture. It's also a time period where you're likely to see the infrastructure put more under stress by the elements. And we see this this dip much more in the rural areas than we see this in the urban areas. When we use the nonlinear model, we see a much, much larger gap. So while the estimates for the rural areas don't change a whole lot, the estimates for the urban areas increase, and the gap between the two also increases. So in this case, we're talking about, on average, about a 6 to 8 hour difference between the urban and the rural areas. Again, we see this seasonal drop that takes place primarily in the rural areas, although here we also see a little bit of a drop in April and June in the urban areas. Main things to take away from this is that when we take into account the nonlinearity, we do see a much larger gap between the urban and rural areas. I should say we did a bunch of other tests here that I'm not going to be showing in order to check to see if there were ways to improve this. So as I mentioned before, we had a baseline survey where we had an idea of levels of education, number of people in the household, their average household usage, things like this that we thought would affect the quality of reporting. We didn't find that to be the case. The people who were, lower education, more people in household, et cetera, they tended to be just as good at reporting as the other people, as the other households were. And so we didn't really notice that there was any effect or that we would have an incentive to select out particular people to do our reporting. Okay, so lessons from this. First of all, crowdsourced reports of electricity reliability are certainly not perfect. There's a lot of noise, especially when we're talking about those mid-levels of electricity reporting. But we can get a relatively reliable signal of the rough outlines of the hours that are available. And the validity of the signal doesn't seem to rely on the individual characteristics of the respondent. So we don't think that there is an issue where you would have to worry about particular respondents giving worse answers than other respondents, based at least on household demographic characteristics. This has the opportunity to actually make a really simple way of getting an idea of electricity access. Phone-based surveys to cell phones are very, very cheap to conduct. from our results, it looks like you really only need a one-question survey to get a reasonable estimate, just simply asking how many hours they had available in the last 24 hours. And it doesn't seem like you get much from trying to build on this or trying to make it more complicated. Over the long term, the ideal is going to be to have, technical measures that you can use in order to measure reliability. Eventually you want to get to a place where, everybody's using a smart meter and you're able to have real-time monitoring and everything else. But it seems like this crowdsourcing method can provide at least a stopgap measure, a way in which we can get an idea of electricity access, the overarching quality of the access, as well as for electricity companies and governments to identify where there are problems in access and to be able to address these in a timely manner without relying on calls for service and other measures which tend to have some pretty severe limitations. So that is my summary of the work that we've done so far. We've been working on the survey and everything else for a relatively long period of time. This is the first time we've been presenting these results. And so we're really looking forward to getting your feedback and your questions. And with that, I'll open it up to the floor. Are there any questions?
So if anybody has a question, you can type it into the chat window and we will then release you from the mute.
Oh, folks, I know I'm not that good at explaining these things. Come on.
Oh, Ryan, maybe I can then break the ice. I'll just ask you, so from this project, what is your experience with, and how would you think about reaching the people? Like, if you wanted to do a systematic effort to get a first blush assessment of energy access in some country, let's say in Africa, how hard do you think that would be?
Well, it depends on how accurate you want your first blush estimate to be, right? I mean, ideally, what you would do is you would get a a block randomized sample of the area that you wanted to cover. You would try to get a representative group of households in order to do this reporting. But that is I mean, that's really if you're trying to set up kind of like what we did. You're trying to get a representative sample and you're trying to get a really good overall estimate. There are other ways to do this that seem to work well without that. I mean, this is one of the things that's really interesting about crowdsourcing, is that crowdsourcing has oftentimes proven to be effective without it being a perfect sample. Things like, flew near you is definitely not a random sample. But it has shown itself to be relatively effective. The key thing here is that, and what differentiates this kind of effort from, say, relying on calls for service, is that you do have to have some effort to reach out and get people reporting. So you've got to do the publicity, and you've got to do the outreach in order to get this to work, because otherwise you're going to end up with just a few regular reporters or people reporting unusual activity. Yeah. All right. So I think we've got some questions now. I'm sure. Who wants to do the calling on? I guess, Julian, you've got a question if you want to start us out.
So we'll see.
Hey there, can you hear me?
I don't know, probably spend most of the time.
Okay, I think we got a bit of a situation here with with background noise and everything. So Ryan, why don't we just go ahead and take the questions as they've written? They're pretty detailed. So Julian is asking about the cost of the devices, their size, ability to detect voltage levels, frequency of data generation, the platform, and Eston is asking a similar question about the technical setup. So maybe you can take both of those at the same time.
Ryan, I think you're muted. I'm not sure if you're speaking.
Yeah, I think, Ryan, you need to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure how I got muted there. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to share the site here in the chat window. So we were working with Prius. This is the website there. And so this is the ESMI data that they have. Let me get the specifications here. I apologize. Trying to find the technical data on the ESM, the electricity supply monitors. So it's a plug-in device that they installed in households, farms, and small commercial establishments. Let's see here. You want to know the frequency at which the data is generated. So it's reported hourly. So we get an hour-by-hour estimate of whether or not there is about the voltage. Their cost, I have to admit, I am not sure how much Prius was paying for those. They're relatively small. They're plug-in devices. In terms of ability to detect voltage levels, we found that they were able to detect pretty minor changes in the voltage levels. So at least from the reporting that came out of them, they weren't just detecting like, 3 levels or anything like that. They were actually detecting intermediate levels, small differences in voltage patterns. So there was some granularity. We weren't seeing like 1 volt changes very often in the data, but we were seeing ones which were higher than that.
So Ryan, if I may jump in here on the cost, I remember seeing somewhere that the cost of the equipment would be a few $100s, but this project was started a few years back. So I think today you would be able to find a lower cost solution. And it's, about the size of a kind of tablet maybe, and you just plug it into the electric socket, and it will give you then the readings from there. You do need then some service space, and you need a way to kind of transfer the data from the device to the cloud, and that means that there's going to be a monthly cost with the devices as well.
Mm-hmm. I can bring up actually an example of the data. All right.
If there are any other questions in the meantime, please do type into the chat window. I think that's the easiest way to get these.
So I'm going to share my screen here again, and you can see the data, what this looks like. So this is what the data from the monitors looks like. You can see it records the amount of time of normal voltage, low voltage, high voltage, and no supply. This is the data that we were working with here. There's also some data that Prius has posted on Dataverse that measures in a different fashion that actually gives voltage levels.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
Any suggestions of things that we should try or that would be interesting? So what is the 60 on the, so there are two different data sets that Prius has released. So what we've been working with is the data from the monitor your power data set that they have online. So we had to go in, download this for the villages, compile it, everything else. And the way that it's structured, again, I'll share my screen so that you all can see what this looks like. So this particular data is compiled as, so you have 1 hour intervals here. And for each hour interval, you have basically how much of that hour was of normal voltage, low voltage, high voltage, or no supply. All right, so you can see you've got each hour, you've got how many minutes were spent in each of these categories. This is really nice because it corresponds with what we are asking people in the surveys. What we're asking people in the surveys is, how much do you, how much during the last 24 hours did you have normal voltage? How many hours or did you notice that there was something off on your electricity? How many hours blackout, things like this. So this corresponds very well with that. There is also, as I mentioned, Prius has provided a data set that we're using for another project where we're trying to utilize satellite data in order to look at reliability. And that data set actually gives the voltages during that time. So this is not the actual voltage levels that they notice. This is the minutes in each of these groupings. Does that make sense?
Ryan, I think there was, yes, another question.
Yeah, I see. So where do we see this being applied next? Honestly, we'd like to see this being applied in a number of different areas. We've talked with some people who have done work in Kenya and Rwanda, and they've noticed some similar issues in terms of measuring electricity quality. That when they go to the electricity companies and they talk with them about how do you know how the grid is performing, they will talk about, well, we get calls from people. We keep track of our calls for service. And so, it'd be very interesting to see what would happen if instead of being passive, if they were active in trying to figure out what the electricity usage looked like. We've also thought about comparing this with other mechanisms for trying to figure out electricity uses. As I mentioned, we've been looking at satellite data monitoring, and so one of the questions becomes what would happen if we would combine various signals from satellite data, from crowdsourcing data, from the monitoring data that's available. Can we improve? This is the model of crowdsourcing efforts like Flew Near You, which is that you Where you really get the big gain is by combining the crowdsourced data with other sources of data. So I think those are two areas where we would like to see this applied next. We'd like to see this applied to a different area to make sure this isn't just something that works in India. And we'd like to see what we can do with combining different signals. Johannes, Asim, do you guys have any other things to mention on that, or?
So I'll just mention one very interesting thing. For example, it's quite interesting to observe that in Pakistan, the quality of electricity access measuring is lagging behind India. And so you could imagine kind of a simple project would be to take this approach, use Pakistani cell phone data to get a sense of what is the kind of rough quality of electricity service in some of the rural areas. Because in India, we really did this as a kind of pilot to see if this works. Whereas in some of the other South Asian countries, including Pakistan, there might be a real need to do this because there is literally no other data, even survey data, available at this time.
Yeah. Yep. And some other things to test out would be what could we do in terms of establishing something like a panel, or there are all kinds of ways. The crowdsourcing literature is pretty rich with different ways of trying to utilize and collect crowdsourced data. And so there are a lot of other things to try out as a first cut. As Johanna said, as a pilot, doing this by random sampling makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is the way you've got to validate it. But, over the long term, trying to experiment with how much we can relax that, I think is another area that we really want to get into.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Doesn't look. Oh.
Yes, please, Julian.
Yeah. So yes, there were incentives provided to the respondents, especially for the baseline survey, because the baseline survey was your standard 15-minute long survey. And so for those, let me get the exact amount here. They were paid about 100 rupees, so about $1.50 US, in order to do the 15-minute survey. In terms of the pay for the survey completes during the time period, we don't have that listed in the paper. Johannes, Asim, do either of you remember what the pay level was for that?
I don't think there was any pay. So just to give some background on that, for the broader phone survey across 10 districts, that was based on a baseline survey for another project, and then we just started calling people. But Julian, to your point, there was attrition. So you did see a situation where in some areas people stopped responding to the calls.
I should also mention one of the main reasons for attrition wasn't necessarily even that they didn't want to be involved. It's that it was sometimes hard to actually even get in touch with them. They may not have been available for a call. So I suppose if you provided some kind of incentive, you may get lower rates of attrition.
Yeah.
A good point.
And that's something too, where, I mean, some of this is just a matter of, we tried to call during the evenings when people were, available. but there were things that happened. Somebody works during an evening, so we miss them. We had some instances where people might not have been able to charge their cell phones. So yeah, we do get a little bit of attrition, and that cut down on the number that we had. If we were trying to do this as a public policy system, we would probably try to make sure that we had a rolling system where when we miss people, we had other people lined up who we could contact.
Mm-hmm. I think we've been talking a lot about the using this as a means to expand the coverage of where we're able to estimate the reliability of electricity, but it's also interesting to think about what effect exogenous shocks or even some policy treatment that's being undertaken at the village or larger levels would have on the reliability itself, and also people's perception of the reliability, and also just treatments that could be administered by the person doing an experiment. So what are some rollover effects in terms of how people perceive the reliability of electricity compared to the actual effects?
Right.
Are there any more questions? We still have a little bit of time if anybody has anything on their mind.
Doesn't look like.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, then thanks everybody for joining us in making history by having the first ERE and ISEP webinar. And of course, particular thanks to Ryan for presenting, and for Shanda and Sonaki for organizing this. We will schedule our next webinar soon, and you can follow us on Twitter at size_ISEP. You can join our email list. All you need to do is just go on our website and subscribe, and stay tuned to new webinars, events, and other activities. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.